Whenever someone tells me they are on hold of a new and positive change in their life, my mind always goes in two opposite directions at once. The first place it goes, and what I say out loud first, is yay! I'm so excited. My second thought, and the one that's harder to voice, is it's going to be hard. Are you getting ready for retirement? Yay! You're going to have so much fun. But it's going to be hard. And hard in ways that you can't even anticipate yet. Getting married? Are you having kids? Are you getting a new job? Yay! You're gonna have so much fun. But it's gonna be hard in ways that you can't quite see yet. Here's the truth the thing that makes even good changes challenging is this. Every new beginning necessarily involves an ending. And those endings can be hard to see and even harder to articulate, and yet must still be noticed and grieved before the new thing can begin. When you retire, you might expect, I'm going to miss my coworkers. I'm going to miss contributing to projects that are meaningful to me. But you'll find, to your surprise perhaps, that unexpectedly you miss the commute. Because that time in the car was that time that you listened to podcasts where you learned about the world. That was your you time. And when perhaps, but still something to be grieved so that you can move forward and fully embrace the new thing. And that grieving, that giving up of the old and opening up to the possibility that's contained in the new, that takes time and it takes space. And that's the journey the Israelites are on in our scripture lesson today. One would think that the journey from oppression to freedom would be like cruising down the highway of joy from start to finish. All bad stuff behind, all good stuff ahead. But it was more complicated than that. The journey from being a people of oppression to being the free people of God involves both a change in physical locality. They have to leave Egypt and find their way to the promised land, but also a transition and a change, not just in their outward circumstances, but also in their inward being. And you can't rush that transition. It happens in its own time, and it needs its own place. For the Israelites, the wilderness is the holding space, the place where they sojourn as God works in them to carry them from what they were to what they will be. In Exodus 15 to 17, it tells three stories that map the challenges that come from change and transition. The Israelites had been delivered from immediate threats, but living into the new takes time, and their anxiety is spilling out all over the place. They're spiraling out of control with their feelings because they are being constantly confronted with their endings, the things that they no longer have. First, they come to Marah, and there is actually water there to drink, but it's bitter. They can't drink it, and they get afraid, and they cry out to God, and God gives Moses a tree, and he throws it in the water so the people can drink. After 45 days of journey in the desert, their food supplies run out. In Exodus 16, they cry out to God because there's no meat and there's no bread. And they said, at least in Egypt, we had food. We could fill our stomachs with bread. There was pots of stew on the stove. We want to go back. But God says, no. There is no going back. There's only going forward. But God sees that loss, and he sees their need, and he says, I will give you manna every day and quail in the evening, so that you might have your fill of meat and bread. And so, sustained by the food and God's promises, they travel to Rephidim, and this time there's no water. And God's changed the water before from to sweet, even though God has been providing them daily bread day after day after day. Once again, the people get anxious. And they say, why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us, our children, and our livestock with thirst? It's a fair question, really. Moses gets mad and says, your quarrel's not with me, but with God. But God doesn't get mad. God just provides. We might judge the Israelites for not trusting in God's provision, but God doesn't judge them for it. Because God sees and understands that learning to trust God's provision takes time. And so the people, as they're confronted with ending after ending, bitter water, no meat, no bread, no water, they cry out to God, and God shows up. They complain, and we call them faithless, but I submit to you, my brothers and sisters, they're actually faithful, because they see their need and they have the courage to name that need. They aren't unfaithful, but they are anxious. And when you're anxious, it's hard to see the presence of God at work in your midst. It's funny to me that they questioned whether God was with them or not. Because through the wilderness, every day they had a tangible sign of God's presence. God covered them as a cloud during the day and was present, but with a fire at night, a pillar of fire. They moved and they camped at the Lord's command, at the Lord's leading, and they could see it. They didn't have to guess. And yet, they still questioned, is God with us or not? And yet they're still wrestling in their spirits, is God with us or not? Because they're anxious, and they can't quite see what God is doing in them yet. But God was right there, right beside them, every step of the way. And when things get hard in the wilderness, when their needs are pressing, God shows up each and every time. They are anxious, and their anxiety leads them to look for the things that they need in the wrong direction. They're looking back to what they knew, to what felt familiar, to what they had before. Sometimes, it feels better to embrace the pain and discomfort that you know than out to God in their distress. And they're right to do so. They need water and they need food, but they're not to get them. God has something better for them than they'll find in the land of Egypt. God has something better for them waiting in the promised land, and more than they can ask or imagine. But for now, they're in the transition. But for now, they're in the in-between, between what was and what will be. And they're anxious, because no one likes the liminal space. No one likes the space between what was and what will be, because it feels like a mighty thing in them, in the unknown, in the mystery of the present that they can't understand or control or predict. God is working in their spirits, in their hearts, preparing them for the promised future. And God sustains them day after day after day. And I love this story so much. Really, I love all three of them. Because sooner or later in our lives, we find ourselves in a place where we are in the in-between, when we're between a beginning and an ending, and we have to rely on the providence of God to see us through. But even though we're utterly dependent on God, when we're in that anxious and uncertain place, it becomes so hard to see God at work. In the unknown, in the in-between, in the hard place, we have to trust that God will show up for us. And that's what we see in this story. We see a story of a people who don't like where they are, but are discovering to their surprise that even in the hard place, God continues to be God for them. God continues to show up for them. God continues to carry them through. We all, from time to time, find ourselves in the space between an ending and a beginning. We find ourselves in that place as peoples in our lives, and sometimes we find ourselves in that place as a church. I think maybe we're in that place right now, actually, where something is ending and something new is beginning, but we can't quite give voice to what it is just yet. I think that's happening at Christ United Methodist Church. I think that's happening in the United Methodist Church and across the church generally. Something is ending. Something new is beginning. But we can't quite name what yet. Every 500 years or so, according to Phyllis Tickle, the church feels compelled to go through a rummage sale, where things are called into question, where things are sorted, and until a new thing emerges. And I think we're in that time right now, right? We feel it in our bones. We're not seeing people come back to church the way that we used to. We get anxious because our membership is declining, and it's not just here, it's everywhere. And we're like, God, what are you up to? God, can we survive this season? God, what's the church going to look like in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? We are going through a shift right now. But God is the Lord of both endings and beginnings, and God has seen the church through transitions before, and God will see us through this one too. 500 years ago, it was the Great Reformation. 500 years before that, it was the Great Schism, where the Roman Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church split, never yet to be reunited. 500 years before that, it was the Council of Chalcedon, which decided who Jesus was and what our proper theology was. We are going through a shift right now. There's no denying it. We are in the in-between place where the church as it once was and worked is ending and a new thing is emerging. It's scary. We're in the wilderness. It's a hard place to be, and our anxiety is rising, and we want to push forward into the new thing as fast as we can. But what we see here in the story is that there is power in the wilderness place. When we come to the end of our resources, whether it's in our lives as individuals or our life together as a church, it forces us to rely on God's provision. And God will never disappoint us. Morning by morning, new mercies we see. All that we needed, God's hand has provided. Great is God's faithfulness unto us. I don't know where you are in the story today. Maybe you, like the Israelites, are in a wilderness space. A space where something has ended or is ending, and the new thing has not yet begun. The wilderness space, our resources, and into the arms of the Lord who will not let us go. So let us not be afraid of the wilderness space, not for ourselves and our own lives or as a church, because it's in the wilderness space that we learn how to trust God. It's in the wilderness space that we are formed as God's people. It is in the wilderness space that God does God's work in us and reforms us and refreshes and renews us. So let us lean in to the wilderness, not shy away. Let us with faithful hearts cry out to God and say, God, this is what I need from you today. Maybe it's insight, maybe it's strength, maybe it's actual food and actual water. And see, to our surprise, to our delight, to our joy, that God shows up with what we need day after day